If you're talking, Larry, we can't hear you.
Sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, can you see my screen now?
Yes, and hear you.
All right. So yeah, so this is a presentation on Windows event logging, a little bit of cloud event monitoring. The kind of the focus on this is it's kind of has a Windows focus, and then the cloud has a bit of an Azure focus, and it's really to sort of the ways you can get up and running when to get your Windows logging in order in a scalable way that can actually get it up and running quickly, do really good log aggregation to certain control points, and then either whatever, and then it's like SIM and tooling independent on the analytics side. So yeah, so that's what we're gonna do here, right? Okay, I guess I have to do with the clicker. All right, so for people who are not aware, Windows actually has a very nice integrated centralized logging, and the reason I'm taking this approach is because in the past people have installed collector agents, log collector agents, SIM agents, for Splunk, Elastic, or whatever, on each individual endpoint. Like people are aware of this thing called file, Win file beat, all kinds of the different Splunk forwarders. And if you have thousands of systems, getting agents deployed out to those thousands of systems is kind of cumbersome and difficult to manage, especially when you got to do updates. That introduces also these third-party agents can introduce security vulnerabilities to your endpoints, especially on things like domain controllers. You want to limit your non-native software on endpoints like that as much as possible. So we're going to talk about how we set this up in a quick and efficient way, and also in such a way that even if you set it up just to get started on a few endpoints, that you can really quickly scale it up to thousands of endpoints, and also manage the policies, the audit policies on these thousands of systems in an efficient, scalable way. So that being said, I'm going to talk a little bit. This presentation is not going to be focused on like what exactly you should be monitoring as far as the specific log events. That would be another presentation itself. This is just a way for you. This presentation is more for a way for you to quickly get up and running, and also to talk a little bit about what you can do once you're up and running and what options you have in the cloud. But just to go over quickly, as a kind of a baseline, these are the must monitor events. So anything related to security event logs being cleared, any changes to high value groups like domain admins, or local administrator groups being changed, local users being created, deleted on member systems, and any new services being installed. So these are like must monitor events. So keep that in mind as you build out your logging infrastructure, and as just some guidance. Some of the stuff that in this presentation that references third-party templates, and also some of our expertise in deploying, working with monitor log endpoint logging systems as well. I'll talk about references to that. So what is this? What is this that's built-in log management server in Windows? It's called the Windows Event Forwarding, Windows Event Collector, WEC for short. So the forwarding element of this is the forwarder sends logs from Windows Event Viewer. So you configure the endpoint and then use that endpoint is integrated with a remote collector server with using a policy, and then it forwards the events, whatever events are in that policy, configured to the collector, and the collector aggregates it aggregates all the data from all the endpoints in it, that are sending it logs, and then you can then it's up to you how you want to consume that. So this is why this is a great SIM agnostic methodology for collecting your logs and managing them. One note is it does require WinRM to be configured on each endpoint, and so yeah, let's just keep that in mind. Okay, so WEF deployment considerations. Okay, so for WinRM, because you absolutely need that. It's enabled on servers 2012 R2 plus, and then workstations are not enabled. So for Windows 10, Windows 11 endpoints, you'll have to enable it. But the good thing is you can just use group policy to do that, and group policy is a very nice way to handle all this. Integrates really well with the whole WEF model. You use a create group policy, and we'll actually go into the details of how to create this group policy. So, and that's part of the hands-on part of this talk. So you take the group policy, apply it to target endpoints, and then the group policy itself contains the WEC address so that it knows where to send the log. So very nicely, you can enroll thousands and thousands of endpoints into a collection, and without even having to go and manually configure each endpoint. You can manage all the logs that you're collecting as well from this WEF model. So how does this work? So there's this thing called a subscription, and this is actually the link between the forwarder and the collector. And what a collector is, the WEC is basically a subscription manager. It accepts the events from the endpoint, and allows you to specify which event log alerts to collect from endpoints. So you actually configure everything via this group policy and WEC infrastructure. So you're not there, on thousands of endpoints, like trying to figure stuff out. You don't have to install agents on these thousands of endpoints. But it makes it really nice, and it doesn't stop you from participating in whatever SIM infrastructure you have, whether it's cloud-based SIM, Splunk. It's doesn't really matter. So subscriptions define the hosts and the collection group. So yeah, so basically the subscription, you define a subscription and on the WEC, and it'll set up basically which hosts are allowed to collect, and then this is also important for some scalability reasons. So you create a subscription, and then you enroll the endpoints that are going to come to that particular WEC in the subscription, and then also subscriptions determines you can configure the events that are coming from these endpoints through the subscription itself. And just to diverge a little bit, another nice thing about this works is now you can actually if you've distributed Sysmon to the endpoints, you can now use the WEF to collect events and from these endpoints. The Sysmon has its own log. Each log type in Windows is like a channel. So Sysmon has its own log. And you can collect that as well. So it's very nice. You get the extra granularity, and from Sysmon, you could by filtering, which we'll get into as well, you can actually tune the types of logs that are coming out of each log type channel on the endpoint. So you can get very granular with this log management, scalable, and then you can also manage it from a limited set of endpoints and group policy, which is actually quite nice. So yeah, so Sysmon, you can add all this extra granular logging, targeted logging, and then you can manage it all with the WEF. And then that doesn't take away from anything else that we've been talking about before with Splunk, with the whatever other, because you could still you could still put, I have a diagram on this, but you could still put the heavy forwarder on the WECs, and so you can get thousands of endpoints with finely tuned granular logging coming into the WECs, and then you just, if in case of Splunk, you just put a heavy forwarder on the WECs, and then boom, you got full integrated SIM and logging, without having to deal with like collecting and managing data from endpoints. Okay. And this is a little bit, I just threw it in here. This is a little bit for people not aware of Sysmon, all the extra granularity that you can get. Now, I know we're talking about a lot about Defender as well in this today, and then but I think Sysmon does provide targeted system activity logging, and I think Defender is more looking for malicious activity rather than just looking at everything. So this is for stuff Sysmon could usually find stuff that maybe Defender missed. So it's a more comprehensive solution. Okay, so yeah, these are just some Sysmon configs. I wanted to include that in. So if people are out there are actually working on some of this stuff. Sysmon modular is a way you can create a custom Sysmon config. We've built some custom Sysmon configs here at the Tech Center as well. I really like Sysmon modular because you can build your own Sysmon config file from it in a very straightforward way. But yeah, so these are the Black Hills. That Black Hills one is very nice as well, and it's based on Sysmon modular. It gives you a good starting point. Okay, yeah, it's just installing Sysmon. It's interestingly enough. So that's the manual way of installing Sysmon. Then we got a GPO way of installing Sysmon, and Velociraptor, which is I talked about in the previously, which is an incident response forensics tool, which is also well integrated with Sysmon as well. Okay, so this is the workflow. So basically, Sysmon, if you want to install, will be there. Then everything goes to Windows event logs, and then everything goes to WEF. And then this is what I was talking about earlier. This is the actual reason why this is great architecture, because it lets you take the endpoints on the left and then group those endpoints, because the WECs have some scalability concerns. So it's like usually the sweet spot is 2,000 to 5,000 endpoints per WEC, and so you can so you want to allocate the different endpoints, and then with the group policy, that's fairly easily done. And then the nice thing about this architecture is, as well, is now that you've got a few of these WECs out there, you've got pretty much can target the auditing in a very scalable way. And then depending on what SIM you use, you just drop as you can see on the right, those are the SIMs. And I'll be talking a little bit about Sentinel towards the end of the presentation. But yeah, as you can see, you can now get all that data, log data, up into the SIM, and only have to manage a few agents, which is quite nice. Okay, so yeah, as we talked about it, WinRM has to be present. Those are I just threw up these few. There's a PowerShell command, and that's a command line, and that'll quickly get WinRM installed if it's not, or tell you if it's installed. Okay, and then this is the group policy object, which we'll get into. This is the basically these are some of the elements of the policy that needs to be configured. So you got to make sure that the WinRM is set up, and then event forwarding is enabled, and these go out to the endpoints. This is the WEF layer, and then it'll specify the collector location and enablement of the forwarding. So this is just a little bit of a summary of what needs to be done, and then we'll get to the details of it. So the WEC, once you set up a WEC, there's a couple, as I said before, 2,000, 4,000 endpoints per WEC. That's just a quick little command to config, set up the WEC on it. WEC can be set up on any domain joint server. So yeah, it's just, that's all the only requirement is a Windows server. And then you can also set it up just by going in the WEC. You go into Event Viewer, and if you click on subscriptions in Event Viewer, automatically basically asks you to set up the WEC. So it's pretty straightforward, actually. Oops, sorry. So yeah, so it's good. So there it is. Yeah. So this is I'm in the WEC on a Windows server in the WEC, and then I go into Event Viewer on the WEC, and then I just basically click on subscriptions, and boom, the little window pops up, and you click yes, and now you got your WEC installed. So it's very simple, not too big of a deal. And then you configure forwarded events. Right. Yeah. So this is configuring forwarded events. You'll want to increase the size of that's the log size. That's basically the log size on the WEC, and that's kind of a very basic, very small. So I would crank that up to maybe a gig or two. Yeah, depending on your log volume. But yeah, this is going to be the size of the log file, and it's a rotating log file. It'll once it's full, it'll just rewrite to the beginning of the log. So it's a rotating log file. Yeah, and then okay, so there's that. Yeah, so this is one basically. So when you're setting up the WEC, it needs to be a bunch of commands need to be set up, needs to be run on the WEC endpoints to get it to work. And then some of them need to be run PowerShell, some of them need to be run in command.exe. This presentation has everything you need to put in there, and these are the commands that need to go into WEC PowerShell. And then this is basically these three commands need to be run on each WEC. The WinRM will tell you whether remote management is installed or not. Set service, setting the WinRM service on the WEC, and then and then the web util for forwarded events. And then this is reason these commands. Now, if the WEC is server 2019 or greater, then so it gets these commands, and this is everything you need to do. These commands actually have to be set up on the WEC to allow for the communication from the endpoints. So this is necessary. And at the end, I'll give you a reference to a video that goes into the hands-on of how to actually set all this up with the dialogue. But this is it for the commands. So these need to go on each WEC, and this is command.exe. Okay. So once you've got all that set up and you've got the WEC installed to run all those commands, and then you basically set up a subscription. This is a subscription dialog, and which is in the subscription section of the event viewer on a WEC. And you actually, if you look at this dialog, you want to make sure that the subscriptions are source computer initiated. You can name it not collector initiated. So very important, source computer initiated. The subscription name, yes, just whatever it needs to be. But yeah, so this is the basics of creating a subscription, and this is basically it's going to aggregate like what endpoints and what logs are going to be coming into the WEC. Now, for says select computers, that's where you enroll the computer. So basically, you click on select computers, and then in there you can choose which endpoints are going to be communicating with this WEC. And now you can also you could choose endpoints, you could choose groups, and then we'll talk a little bit about some scalability techniques for grouping computers so that they only connect to certain WECs. All right, so yeah, here we go. We're adding WEF endpoints to the WEC. And that was what I was talking about. So this is just what you see when you click on that, adding computers. Now, so this is a kind of an interesting one. So this is a starter event filter. So this is going to specify for the particular WEC and endpoints what it's going to collect from that endpoint, and it's an XML file, and then and then basically here you can tune and you can add channels to the subscription. You can modify the way the event's being collected from each particular channel. And I could show you this. We'll break out of here for 1 sec. We can see this real quick here. I have it. I just click on it here. Just wanted to show everyone this. Hey, Mir?
Yes.
Well, how much time do I have? I just want to
sure. You have plenty of time, so we have another 20
just want to be cognizant of the time.
20 minutes. And so.
Okay, cool. All right, so let's take a look at this here. All right, so this is the filter, and this goes into we'll go into the subscription when you event specific. Okay, so yeah, as you can see, this is basically this goes into the what you're going to collect at the endpoint. You can see in here, it's collecting application logs, system logs, Windows Sysmon, PowerShell logs. So you can specify all the logs that you're going to collect. This is a good template, and you can tune this. You can add events to it. But yeah, so this template get started gets you most of what's important. This one has Sysmon in it as well. You can always if you're not running Sysmon, you can remove it. But yeah, so there it is. This has got pretty good basic logging, and this will get distributed to each one of the endpoints that subscribe to this WEC. So yeah, basically that's that. Okay. All right, so there we go. And then this is just something about the subscription configuration dialog, advanced. You want to minimize bandwidth latency, we'll send the data quickly. Another thing is it's going to have an HTTP or HTTPS. You can select HTTP because the actual payload of the packets is encrypted already. So HTTPS would be double encryption. HTTPS is useful if you're pushing to onto a server offsite or into a cloud endpoint. So because that requires an HTTPS connection for authentication. But that's available too. If you want, let's say you want to send you have a WEC in the cloud and you want to send the data directly to the WEC in the cloud. So you could do HTTPS here as well. Yeah, so there's the query filter. This is actually let me show this. I'm gonna break out here real quick just to kind of show you what all this business looks like. Okay. All right, so here we go. Here we are in the WEC, right? In event viewer in the WEC. Forwarded events, subscriptions. So we go to subscriptions. Subscription. All right, yeah. So there we go. So this is what I showed you before. So this is my one subscription on this server. This is the other server, which is the domain controller connected in here. This is the subscription I have set up here. That's the subscription name. And then if you go to select events, you can see that's where you just literally, oh, yeah, sorry. You literally just paste that XML file into this tab, and then you're good to go, basically. And then the great thing about it is that this is that every time you update this, you change the log configuration on that your WEC group. On any endpoint subscribed to that WEC, automatically when it connects, it's going to update its filter, and it's going to change. You can tune the actual logging on the endpoint just from this location here. So it's quite nice for distributed scalable management. Yeah. So okay. So there we go. That's your WEC event query filter. Here we go. Right. So we talked about that. Minimize latency. All right. So now we're gonna create a group policy for the WEF endpoint. So this is basically just to sort of give you sort of a background on what we're going to go through these next few slides to kind of show you what it is. So this is the policy here I have. This is my domain. This is my WEC policy. This is what the policy looks like. These are the elements of the group policy that we're gonna modify. And yeah, so you can see this is the first slide. It's going to be we're going to create in restricted groups for the policy. We're going to have to give the event log readers group this network service capability. So we're going to do that. Right. So you go into restricted groups in the group policy, and then you add for the event. You add the event log readers group, and then you give it the network service membership, so that basically the event log readers groups is able to read events. This is needed for it to read, for the endpoint to read the WEF endpoint to read the logs and send it to the WEC. So this is required in the group policy. This is the group, as I said, this is the group policy we're going to push out to the WEF endpoint. So this is the beginnings of it. And so this is the first modification you need to make as you create this group policy in restricted groups. Adding network service, NT authority network service event log readers group. All right. Second thing we need to do is in system services, we need to under Windows remote management, we need to make this start up automatically. So we have a WinRM starting up automatically on each endpoint. It's another important thing. All right, and then this is the other event forwarding. We enable event forwarding. We can bump up the forwarding rate. 100, 200 is probably good. Bump up the forwarding rate a bit. So that's the event forwarding resource use. We need to add that. And sorry. All right, and then I think that's it. Oh, okay, we got that. Okay, yeah, okay. Sorry about that. I missed one thing here. Yeah, so then after you set up the event forwarding, you basically you configure subscription manager, and then you put in this string. It's basically the FQDN of your WEC server. And then the rest of it is basically standards, WSMan, subscription manager, and then the WEC refresh rate. So that needs to be added. And then under under the event log service of the policy, you want to make sure that you add this weird log access string, which I put up there. This is kind of kind of a weird thing, kind of one of those sort of hard to it's not well documented, and it's especially for domain controllers. But in the security section of the event log service in the policy group policy, you have to add this string in the log access. So that's important. That's why I put this in here. That string up there. Okay. And then there we go. Once you get all that configured, there's the WEC subscription. Source computer is checked in, it'll tell you per subscription which source computers have checked into that subscription. Yeah, and there you go. Okay. Right. So pitfalls for WEC deployment. So the network service account needs to have access to log readers group. We talked about that, how to configure that in the policy. WinRM is required. We talked about that. Scale WECs adequately. We talked about that. So each one of these WECs should have 2,000 to 4,000 endpoints. And then just a little bit is, you know, when you're first getting started, you know, start with like targeted areas so that you can, you know, debug everything and make sure everything's working nicely. And then this is another interesting thing here. So as you scale up these endpoints, now what's going to happen is each WEC, then there's actual each event, as each endpoint has a registry entry in the WEC, and so as thousands of endpoints come in, they're going to this registry key is going to have these endpoints added to it as an event source. Now, as you decommission endpoints, you're going to have to prune the registry. So this URL has a nice set of tools that basically has scripts that basically just run it on the WEC, and it automatically, you run it as a scheduled task, and automatically will prune the registry for you. So periodically run that task, and if endpoints have been decommissioned from the WEC, it'll automatically prune those out. Another script on here is basically a script for audit. Basically, what it lets you do is it creates multiple groups, and then it'll auto assign WEF endpoints to those groups, and then those groups are actually managed by the WEC. So this way, you will automatically get the right server to the right WEC. And I think we could take a quick peek at that script. Oh, sorry about that. Yeah. So this is for more like when you're like have multiple WECs, and then you need to auto assign WEF endpoints to different groups, and then have those groups as enrolled in each WEC for that particular set of endpoints. And this way you can scale it to quite a large amount. Okay, let's see here. Okay. Here. So yeah, so here it is. It's the maintain computer group script, and then this script here will actually basically it auto subscribes the endpoints to the different groups, and then as those groups, you just add a group. You just then instead of adding individual computers, you just add the groups to you know that each WEC is enrolling, and then this script will automatically assign your endpoints to those groups, and then yeah. So in this way, you can as you know, get a very, very scalable environment going. So there's that. Okay, so let's get back on track. So it's WEC Advanced Deployment, and then there's another nice little project here, which it's got some really nice scripts for setting up logging, and this has got some very nice. DEFCON 3 is actually quite nice. It's got a bunch of scripts. So setting up Sysmon, configuring EDRs, network device logging, and things like that. So yeah, so this is worth taking a look at. It's also in that Black Hills thing. Okay, so now I'm going to go step into a little bit of the cloud stuff here. Talk a little bit about Azure Monitor. So Azure Monitor, what is Azure Monitor? Basically, it's kind of in Azure, it's kind of the baseline log analytics. So basically, it works both from logs in native Azure as well as logs from on-prem. You can bring all those in. So so in the case of what we just talked about, so if you would just put the on-prem Azure on-prem the log agent on those WECs, and then you can bring all this data into Azure Monitor, and to do analysis and analytics. And you can also then use, which we'll talk briefly about, Sentinel, which is a sort of I think Azure Monitor is kind of like a sort of like a data aggregation platform with a little bit of analytics, like very like mini SIM, but then Sentinel is kind of like a full-blown SIM, like with all the bells and whistles and the threat hunting capability and all that, which we'll touch upon. But so this is Azure Monitor, and so it can take logs and events from all of Azure basically, and then also from external sources, on-prem sources, like we just talked about with the WEC infrastructure. So some of the Azure activity logs that we can bring in. You can bring in the administrative activity logs, security logs, policy logs, service health logs. All that's available in Azure Monitor. You can monitor Azure AD, all of Azure activity logs, all the security logs. You can set up something, and we'll talk about it a little bit. It's a workspace where you bring all these Azure AD logs in, and then you can do some analysis on just some insights. You go to, like, analyzing atypical travel, like atypical logons, IP addresses with malware, password spraying. All this is doable within Azure Monitor, and not to. I'm focusing on, just because for sake of time, I'm focusing on Azure. The Azure side of the house for cloud, with Azure Monitor Sentinel, but Splunk can do the same as well. Here, Splunk has the same capabilities. It can take these logs as well. It could take the WEF logs as well with the heavy forwarder. So this is just because focusing on Azure for cloud right now for sake of time. So that's Azure AD Monitoring, which you can do with Azure Monitor. Then infrastructure monitoring. This actually lets you monitor infrastructure, and this is kind of would be on VMs, and that's not infrastructure components of VMs running in Azure, or VMs running in on-prem. So either you'd have the log analytics agent, which is apparently being deprecated now, and we got Azure Monitor agent is coming actually more into play, and then but that Azure Monitor agent requires an ARC. It's a external multi-cloud Azure framework. We'll touch on that very briefly, but anyway, so for infrastructure monitoring, so you got these agents. They can run in Azure, on Azure instances, both Linux and Windows, and also on-prem. So you can sort of integrate your whole Azure infrastructure with your on-prem infrastructure very nicely. And this is so in order to get started with logging, right? So you basically create this thing called a log and analytics workspace. So this is kind of in Azure Monitor. This is kind of where you bring all the data into and where you manage the data. So this is what the log analytics workspace looks like. As you can see, you can bring in different data sources, and then you can then proceed to do some type of an analysis on it. I've got a few slides on that as well. So this would be okay. So this would be like sort of a log subscription, centralized log architecture on Azure, right? So you have the different subscriptions. The nice thing about it is these subscriptions can be in different tenants, right? In different accounts, different tenants, and you can actually have a central log aggregation workspace. and then you can just pull only the logs that you want into the central log subscription, which is nice for security because you may not want application logs or performance logs and that type of log in a sort of a security analytics space. So this lets you just grab like resource logs, which tell you what's going on in the with the Azure Resource Monitor and like what the infrastructure, what's happening in the infrastructure of these different subscriptions. So this is kind of a nice like centralized log architecture, highly distributable. Yeah. And then this is kind of what the log analytics workspace looks like when you bring in different types of data in. So this is the VM on the left, and these VMs can be these instances can be in Azure, I believe it could even be in other clouds, and then or on-prem. And then you've got the log analytics agent, which then uses this workspace ID and key to push data to the log analytics workspace. You can also Azure Monitor metrics, right? So just some metrics can be pushed. Then you can per Azure Monitor agent, which is requires an Azure VM or Arc, as we said. Yeah, you then that the nice thing about Azure Monitor is it deals with all this work system, the system side it manages identity, endpoint identity for you. It makes it a little easier to bring data in. That goes to the login. It's really a nice thing you can do also in a workspace. You can also push data out to storage, cold storage, different types of storage, so you can have archives and stuff like that, and just have only certain amount of data in a workspace one time, save money, and then you can push out stuff with Event Hub, so if you're doing alerts and stuff like that. And then Sentinel actually sits on top of workspace log analytics workspaces, so you put a Sentinel instance. And I know that each college with the A5 licensing or is going to get some of this is just available right out of the box as part of your package. So you've got a lot of this. We're going to be able to set up some log analytics workspaces. You can even throw your own little Sentinel on top of it. So you have with the WEF architecture, you could quickly do a very nice sort of like build your own log analytics infrastructure in a highly scalable, easy to manage way.
We are running out of time, Larry. So
okay, all right. Well, I'm getting there. How much more? 5 minutes? 10 minutes?
5 minutes is good. Yeah.
5 minutes. Okay, I'll quickly go through the rest. Okay, so I think we got the message. That was kind of mostly what I wanted to get through. Like, so you've got the building your Windows infrastructure, logging, aggregating that, and then bringing it into the cloud, as in this case the Azure Monitor with the log analytics workspace. Then this is a little bit about Arc. So Arc is this is the Arc architecture. So this is basically the on-prem stuff, and then this basically lets you push data to log analytics, and this is needed if you're using the AMA architecture. And then Azure Sentinel, real quickly, it sits on top of log analytics workspace that we just talked about, has over 96 data sources, very robust, has SOAR, so you can actually create security playbooks with all your data, so you can actually analyze the data and then do automation on the analysis and then do responses, scripted responses, yeah. So what is the value of Sentinel? It adds machine learning, it adds correlation analysis rules. You can crystal clear language alerts, create incidents, monitor workbooks, rule templates. Yeah, so different. You set up the types of events you want to alert on, like MFA disable user, password spraying. You can fire off playbooks that integrates with Azure Logic apps, where you see a bunch of password spraying, and so you can create a lock out that particular endpoint, a malicious endpoint, or if MFA is full user, send them a warning or disable them. There's all kinds of things you can do with these playbooks. Okay, hunting. It's got built-in hunting templates, so you can set up queries on your data and integrate data that comes in, and then you can look for anomalous activity. These are the workbooks. This lets you set up, analyze the data, set up charts and like graphs of statistics. So it's really great for doing quick analysis, hands-on the live analysis of events, and especially if you're looking to see some statistical graphs and stuff like that, very good for that, the Sentinel workbooks. These are the playbooks which I talked about. You can create playbooks, so you can do a full automation of the responding to certain events. And it also has Sentinel has a nice integration with threat intelligence. So different threat intelligence feeds are totally integrated. So you can actually bring in your threat intelligence feeds through this industry standard taxi framework. And then the conclusion. So yeah, WEF is a great way to aggregate logs, especially in large environments. It actually works great in small environments too, but once you get thousands of endpoints, it's instead of trying to manage agents on each endpoint, it's a great way to go. You can manage your subscriptions using filters, so you don't have to mess around with tuning, logging on each endpoint. You minimize your SIM agents, your log collector agents. You get SIM flexibility, which means you're not stuck on a certain SIM. You can push data to multiple SIMs if you need to. And then Azure Monitor with Analytics Workspace provides an effective way to aggregate multiple log sources and perform analysis. And then you got Sentinel as well, which is kind of like the more advanced, full-on security and analytics framework. And yeah, that's basically it. And then there's a nice reference which goes into setting up WEC, which covers a lot of what I covered, but you got also a guy guiding you through it, hands-on. So that's what I got. So any questions?
Yeah, I think somebody had their hand raised. If they can type their question.
Yeah.
Did Jennifer had a question, Cindy, or I can understand this?
No.
So you sent some message here.
Oh, Dan has some questions.
Okay. Can you use other accounts beside network accounts? Larry?
I'm not sure about that. It's a good question. You mean for the data collection? You mean, I guess maybe.
If you want to send an email to.
I mean.
He said if you can then use PowerShell endpoints in RM and set services accounts.
It's possible. I don't know. The minimum requirement is that the log readers group, in order to send data to the WEC, needs to have that permission. It's possible. I haven't tried that method, but yeah, I mean, I'll look into it and let you know. And as far as I see that other question, right, WEC isn't really load balance capable. You're load balancing, but what you could do is you could specify multiple WECs in the group policy, and you can, if one WEC isn't available, they'll go to a different WEC. So that's kind of how you would do the load balancing, actually. But definitely I'm about the endpoint permissions. I did need to do research on that, but yeah, and this is kind of the architecture. As we work on the SOC, this is the architecture we're going to go with for the endpoints, and we probably right now we've got Splunk as a SIM, but this is a good architecture to get the endpoints up and going. And then so the other one is the path to hash attack. Evil win RM. You want to make sure that the win RM is locked down. You have good authentication. So the path to hash attack is going to, you want to make sure that you're sort of locked down, and the hashes aren't easily accessible, and you've got something maybe running on that endpoint that prevents the pass the hash type of activity. But yeah, that's something to do with your lateral, your endpoint EDR and your lateral movement sort of strategy, and making sure you're not leaking hashes on the network with LLNMR and all that stuff. So pass the hash attack is actual infrastructure configuration. It has nothing to do with this. This WinRM is required for the communications between the WEC and the WEF. So that's mostly what it's about. Oh, okay. Then there's a. Okay. All right. There you go. Now Dan figured it out. WinRM can have IP allow lists. Okay. So there's the answer where you can limit what can connect. So you could just keep yeah, so you can lock down the WEC WEF interaction. Yeah, and that's probably configurable through the group policy, like when you push down the group policy configuration for the WEF. Yeah.
All right. I guess if you guys have any further question, Cindy, if you want to post Larry's email address, folks can email him and he will respond accordingly. Let's regroup in 10 minutes around 11:20 with our next talk after the break. So thank you very much. Hang tight.